My name is Ofri Cnaani, and I'm here today with Sarah Keenan and Sandra Noeth. And this is the second iteration of Corpo realities. Sorry for repeating myself if you heard it before, but so these are three short, or not short, like an hour-long conversation between practitioners and theoreticians around different aspects that kind of expand the idea of the choreographic through questions that are more political, legal, that's related to technology and others. And this title is this session titled The Right to Bodily Integrity, and it bring into this conversation also kind of question of critical law and property and others. So thank you for joining me. And I really feel that so many terms and provocations from last night, not only theoretical terms, but also interventions that we experienced in the very first part of the evening are kind of keep traveling, or there are residues, to use your term, are kind of keep being on stage and in the room, and definitely the conversation with Arkady and Semana that we just heard is very much going to, relevant to our. So it's nice because we don't start, we continue, which is always easier. So really thank you for being here. I maybe just kind of quickly introduce the two of you. And Sandra, you've been writing about kind of from embodiment and the politics, on spatial politics, question of borders, and with Arkady, who just spoke, you had a project called Violence of Inscriptions in Berlin for a couple of years ago, and with Guru, a project or publication called Bodies of Evidence, which I feel is very relevant to our discussion. And you work quite a bit in Palestine and Lebanon and the Middle East, which again kind of tie to other topics. And Sarah, thank you for joining us. And you're co-established or co-lead the Center of Research and Race at Birkbeck, and thought quite a lot and expandedly in question of property and how can we inverse maybe our legally informed or publicly informed, misinformed ideas of property. And I would like to today kind of bring those set of concerns also with the choreographic, with question of embodied knowledge, embodied practices. We spoke about witnessing before, and that maybe will travel into our conversation as well. So first, thank you so much for being here. And as a way of introduction, I thought just maybe each one of you can maybe take this term of the right to bodily integrity, but situate your own work and share with us how you got to what you do now, how you got to be interested in those sets of this term or this set of questions, or how you walk into those conversations. So, who wants to start?
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ofri, for having me here, and to Sandra for the engagements that we've already had sort of in the lead up to today. The right to bodily integrity, I mean, to be honest, is not a term that I use in my work, and is not something that really exists in law. There is not. There are various. I mean, law as well is not, as anyone with a law degree knows, is not actually a very coherent set of knowledge. It's really a set of procedures based on words that are then reiterated and embedded into society in various ways that sort of become invisibilized. But there are, for example, in one of the EU conventions, there is a right to, I think, physical and mental integrity. but the body is actually quite absent from law. If we look at the sort of raw materials that constitute law for lawyers, I'm a Australian and British trained lawyer, so it's the common law. So we look at the judgments produced by courts and then the legislation passed by Parliament. The body really appears quite rarely, mainly in the context of criminal law, when the body is is assaulted or penetrated or interfered with or indeed killed. Instead, in law, the term that tends to appear is person, but a legal person is not embodied. A legal person, corporations, for example, are legal persons. They're rights-bearing legal persons. And so then, I think as a kind of attempt to redress that situation from a social justice perspective, we have human rights law, which has, existed in various forms for a long time, but exists in a particular way in the post-World War II era. International human rights law exists, but we know that it's not very effective, because to be human, not every human in the sort of taxonomical sense of how we would categorize humans get counted as humans for the purpose of human rights law. So the body law is quite a disembodied discipline, I would say. And so I think perhaps why I've been invited here is that I do think about the body in law quite a lot, but mainly I have thought about it in the, the political context of what happens to migrants and also to Indigenous people in settler colonies. So what happens to particular bodies in particular spaces under legal regimes. And I have found that thinking about property is very generative and informative in that respect. But maybe I'll sort of stop now and...
I want to hear, maybe we'll do an introduction and then maybe we can show one of the projects you work on more specifically unfolded.
Exactly. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ofri, for having us. I do really enjoy how these conversations develop from yesterday, and also not knowing us at all. It is really a kind of encounter which has specific quality, I think. So I guess the notion of integrity of a body, I think even before the word came into my work, it was there on a practical level, working in collaboration with Akari, many other people, working around questions of how do bodies, let's say, appear as agents and witnesses, symbolic sites, and so on in corporal political realities. And in particular, there was the work with borders, about experience of borders in Middle Eastern context, and it came really from an absence, if you want, of different kind, which was like when looking at literature, but media coverage and so on, there was bodies, obviously, but they were either collectivized bodies, and if you think of media coverage now of migration and so on, you mostly see bodies as groups and masses, or sometimes you even will not see faces or something. No, it's very anonymized. Or there was bodies as weapons, so certain tropes. But then I was thinking, living through these border realities, there is a lot about somatic levels, Borders are there much before you enter any kind of infrastructural border, or like borders in the sense of not being able to have a vision at all, or imagining things differently, so that kind of stuff. So I was thinking about how could, let's say, experiences or practices that we have from performing arts, for instance, dance, choreography, how can they open up certain strategies of looking in parallel at these kind of situations. So that is more like as a backdrop, and it continued with this notion of integrity, and exactly as you're saying, it is laid down in many, many laws, but often as a kind of enumerated freestanding right, So it is like kind of, how do you say that, put next to other rights, and somehow it seems to be a bit of an inherent value, so the integrity and so on. But if you look twice, it's really extremely problematic, not only because these laws are very often based on Western bodies, no, very specific kind of bodies, excluding most of the bodies of the world, actually. But also because, like when I'm also thinking about dance and choreography, there is like ideas of wholeness, of completeness, of authenticity, and so on, that have been challenged, for example, in our field a lot in the last years, but they still stay problematic. So I guess also linking up to research that has been done by artists, but also by scholars of different disciplines about inclusions and exclusions, ableisms, and very many other things. We were really thinking about how to think at all about bodily integrity, whereas the experience of bodily experience is, to my mind, per se incomplete and per se fragmented. So what does it mean to be protected, and how is value generated very differently and very unequally for different bodies? So that was a starting point. And yeah, maybe I keep it here and we can talk about examples later. But so the status of the body is obviously at the core of these questions. No, is it an object or is it a subject, or what is it at all, you know, in these terms? So it's very interesting hearing you say that, well, there is this person that does, you know, that, yeah.
I actually do feel like example or a specific research case could help to kind of unfold those questions. And no, Sarah, you've been using the terms subversive property, and I was hoping you can maybe kind of expand and share with us your thinking, and maybe kind of ground it in a specific research to help us think with you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, how I came to be thinking about property, and then about, I suppose, what property does. And the idea of subversive property really is, I guess, an argument that I'm trying to make that that bodies out of place shift things. So bodies that are out of place and that manage to stay out of place. So there is a temporal element. There has to. It can't just be a sort of, you know, a momentary blip in what we consider proper, or the hegemonic norms of what is proper, but that bodies that persistently are where they do not belong are not just victims, that their very being in that place generates something that is spatial and material, and that I think it's worth paying attention to. And I guess, yeah, I do come from I work in a law school, and so I'm a social justice oriented lawyer, and I guess the legal answer to for example, instances of racist violence, the legal answer is, very individualized, kind of, that requires the victim of racist violence to be a victim. That's and then seeks redress through locating a particular perpetrator. And so, I mean, I guess sort of similar to broader approaches to law and to looking at situations like, forensic architecture obviously works with lawyers quite a lot, and is looking at more holistically at the space and what is happening at the space, and to think about that. So, so how I... Well, okay, I want to say a couple of things about property. So one is, this is something that I thought about in, because I don't know anything about choreography, but one thing that I thought in being sort of prompted to think about the right to bodily integrity was that, certainly in the common law context and throughout the British Empire, the key sort of philosophical justification for property, and really not just property, but for the whole sort of system of liberal governance that we have, one of the key thinkers is John Locke, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Was a 17th century English Enlightenment writer whose justificatory theory of property starts with the body, and it's a very intuitive theory. I think students love it. It is that everyone starts out owning themselves. And so again, he doesn't, I mean, his language is of the time, and he doesn't, actually he might sometimes use the word body, but the idea is that every man starts out, every man starts out owning his own body, and then the world is owned in common. The world is just owned by God, so it's in a state of nature, and he's talking about America explicitly, and so once you mix yourself, the body that you own, with land that is in the state of nature, that is owned by no one, that land, it's like your body expands out into the land that was formerly commonly owned, and it becomes yours by way of natural right. It's a deeply religious text, actually.
The term is so loaded.
Yeah, it is. Yes.
It's like I'm jumping.
So it's Locke's not usually discussed in terms of bodies at all, but it's a very embodied theory, and something else that I always point out in the text of that small chapter of his second treatise is that. Well, so alongside the self-owning man, who is absolutely an able-bodied and upper-class Anglo-European man, is that there is the lazy Indian. So the lazy Indian doesn't own land because he hasn't enclosed it and he doesn't use it properly. He's letting it waste. And the only thing for Locke that the lazy Indian ever properly owns is the food that he literally puts into his body and then excretes. So it is interesting because on the one hand, the ideal property owning subject for Locke starts with the body, but is also more than the body, because that property owner is not reduced to their sort of bodily functions that they can only ever own a piece of fruit that they eat off a tree. There is always the capacity with that white body, that white male body, to be more than just a body. Whereas the non-white body, or he's referring specifically to Native Americans, of course it was a similar justification in Australia and New Zealand, those bodies are deemed to only ever be bodies and nothing more, because the only thing they can ever own is what they literally put into their body. So anyway, so these are that's the kind of key a key thinker on property. Of course, there's also like Hegel's theory of property, and both of them, they're very different thinkers, but see property as essential for subjectivity. To be a subject, you must have a relationship with property. But in the way that they set it up, the body is racialized, is gendered, and I also think, I actually think some of the scholarship from disability studies is really interesting and helpful. I think that body is also able-bodied. But anyway, so that wasn't a specific example. That's the theory, I guess, that I'm coming from. And then, I started thinking about it in terms of what Australia does to refugees, and also of some of the contestations over land, also in Australia.
Can you say a few things?
Okay.
Is that okay? Yeah. Just.
Yeah, I mean, so some of you, this is, politically it's quite relevant at the moment actually because of what Patel is proposing with sending refugees to Rwanda, but Australia has long sent refugees arriving by boat to small Pacific islands, Nauru and Manus Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea specifically. Yes, and really extreme levels of violence happen to these people, both in the sense that there have been many deaths, but also in terms of what is done to them on a kind of slower violence level is quite extreme. This was actually how I came to study, is because I was so upset about what Australia does to refugees. But then when I started just looking at refugee law, it was very limited in what you could really think or say about it, and very much refugee law really requires a hyper-performance of victimhood by the refugee, a hyper-performance of victimhood and a real kind of demonization of the culture from which they've come, of the nation state of which they come. They must be the perfect victim, and their state must be the perfect persecutor. And this really reproduces, extremely colonial tropes, and also again it's the refugee, the asylum seeker must perform this victimhood. And so I guess how I wanted to think about it differently, and thinking about property not just in the terms of like legal rights of ownership, but also in the terms of its other meaning of what properties we have, what characteristics we carry about in the world, is to I analysed the refugee appeals for status as a property transaction, in the sense that for example, the Australian, but also I looked at the British and the Canadian states, in requiring these performances of victimhood and of sort of savagery of their home countries. It was like a taking of property from them. So that was the trade-off, is that you give us this performance of victimhood, and really many refugees, not all, but some of them are really quite, some of them are political dissidents, some of them are gay and lesbian, and persistently so in very difficult circumstances. These are powerful people. What has rendered them potentially stateless is their subversive property. It is, it's something about them that's actually quite threatening to power.
Improper.
Absolutely, it's totally improper. Yes, yeah, and I think that's a coincidence in meaning is not accidental. And so I guess it's just trying to think about these situations in terms of what is happening, and in a way that doesn't sort of persistently re-victimize and take the agency from these people. Yep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So many things to pick up, but I'm gonna try to focus. I mean, there is something about systems of values and validation that you, and maybe to extend it, of judgment, or that come into play in the processes that you describe, and that was also something that we were interested in. And actually, at the moment, I'm kind of working in a bigger research project that brings together artists, but also scholars from different fields, activists. It's titled very simply Bodies Unprotected. So it really thinks about the notion of protection as an activity, that we are all involved in. So you speak about involvement of lawyers, legal entities, and I guess the question, and we had this question of responsibility, or scale, like where do you come in with your work, also in the previous panels, I think. So, and that's a 2 or 3 year project, and you can check it out on the internet. I'm not going to explain everything, but I'm taking one example, or maybe 2, to connect to what you're saying, Sarah. And so at the moment, I'm working in a research with Hakan Topal. He's a Turkish artist, a media artist. And we were actually looking at how are bodies validated in like economically, in conflict, for example. So in particular, Hakan did earlier research that was related to the Roboski massacre, and now we're continuing in bodies at border regions, Kurdish, Turkish, Syrian border regions, and so on. And to cut a long story short, and you can find evidence very easily online, so I very much think there was an extremely significant comment from Irid Rokov just 10 minutes ago about that we also choose not to see, and that we spend a lot of energy in maintaining that kind of ignorance. But okay, that was a side note. So in the work with Hakan, basically, it started by just looking at facts and at court decisions that, for example, would allocate a certain amount of money to one dead body in a, let's say, a Kurdish body in a certain conflict, and an American or Western body, a European body, and the numbers are different, let's say, 50 times more, obviously, for a Western body than. And not only this, the Western bodies are, and here I come back to Arkadi's work, they have names, they have date of birth, they have all these kind of things. The non-Western bodies don't have anything, they appear collectively as numbers. So that was a starting point, and that came with also thinking about maybe with artistic practice or with aesthetic practice, we can work on a different scale. So the matter of scale was pretty significant to really go see these people, find these families, look at gestures, movements, at the stuff that is not said, that circulates a little bit as social wounds, if you want, traveling wounds, that is not so easy to locate, and think about, okay, where, next to the numbers and the court decisions and all of this, where does that sit, and what type of bodies does it produce, how do these wounds travel, and so on. And of course, if we think about migration and racial research, we are in the middle of the topic. So that's one project we're working about, but there is another one which literally deals with ownership. And ownership in relation to dead bodies. And the thing that triggered it is already maybe 10 years old. It's a project by Lina Meshdalani, a Lebanese artist. And she was thinking very concretely about what to do with her body after she passes away in the Lebanese context, where basically a dead body belongs to the state. So it is not your individual body, but it belongs either to religious or at the same time to religious communitarian communities, or it belongs to the state. So that means that you do not have individual decision on what should happen to your body after you pass away. So that was a question that she responded to in a project titled Appendix, a performance project, but also a kind of net art project. And we took it on again in light of racial violence in the US in the last couple of years, together with James Martell, who also wrote a really beautiful book about the subversive potential of dead, and as he mentions it, unburied bodies. And actually, and here I come back to what you were suggesting, to not look at these dead bodies as victims in the first place, but to really also understand that there is an agency that consists in withdrawing from the systems that the state has set up to protect bodies, and that in the withdrawal there's also a certain capacity to some point to subvert legal, for example, structures and so on. So that's very interesting for me to hear about that. Maybe last thing, I guess that notion of scale in relation to the right to bodily integrity, on a very personal level, not as a research, but as a person, I was really thinking, yesterday we also heard about how to deal with that that drive to urgency. There is COVID, there is crisis, there is this and that, and we urgently should do something and quickly and have statements and stuff. And the refusal that both André and Irid Rokov also kind of uttered to not go there, not to kind of maybe just acknowledge what is happening, and also rather than engage in quick solutions. And I think there is something in this right to bodily integrity to maybe make it a collective concern again, to get it out of the universal realm, because of course in international human rights laws it is a universal paradigm. If it works or not is a different question, but it is set up as a universal paradigm. And then it is also something that is still linked to, at least in European context, to the idea of personhood, no? So to individual bodies. But how can this capture realities, that are strongly collective? How can it carry exactly what you're talking about, the wounds of migrants, of racial violence, all of that? That has so many different dimensions that are also embodied, that are somatic, all of this. And how can it also work against the political rhetoric of, shielding off and closing the borders and fixing the wounds? And no, so we were thinking, how can we actually keep those wounds open, no? And how can we look at them closely and make these questions collective concern again? I know it sounds very optimistic, and I'm very aware that this is something that can more be a kind of a push of a motivation into a research rather than, and we spoke briefly before, Sarah and I, there is reality check at some point, no? So where can you go with the research that you're doing? But I would love to hear much more about it.
I mean, I can ask them if they feel like it's happening.
So there's lots of overlaps in the kinds of questions that we're thinking about, albeit from very different angles. I guess one thing I was thinking when you were speaking about borders and bodies is, a number of theorists have sort of said this now, but that the border is not as we imagine it. The border is not a line on a map. The border is everywhere, and the border. There's a line from an activist group in Australia that I think took inspiration from South American activist groups, that we don't cross borders, borders cross us, and that the border regimes are productive of a space of a nation state, but also of bodies, and border regimes rely on racial violence against particular bodies, which are produced as racialized in that moment of violence, as the border asserts itself. I guess it's interesting to me. Sorry if this is a sort of stupid question, but just as someone who generally doesn't engage with people who study the performing arts, is how you've come to such political questions, like that just so far exceed the kind of ideas of. When I heard choreography, I think of like dance halls, but actually you're dealing with, well, not quite, but a question that I wanted to ask sort of both of you, and that I was interested from the panel before, was this might relate to your project on the dead body and like what is done with it, but is the question of evidence, and how you're thinking about that and why it's so important to you. And I guess I can think about that, when I think of course, like evidence, and a performance is evidence of something, but I'd been trained to think of evidence in a very different way, and evidence is required in order to prove something to an agreed source of authority, and the rules of evidence are very strict and very difficult
Yeah. No, I remember I wanted to bring exactly the question of evidence, and maybe actually to use the title of your book about bodies of evidence. And I remember in the conversation we had before, you, Sarah, said, I'm very curious about your notion of evidence, and the very first thing you kind of frame it is kind of pointing out how it's the very flitting term, how it's actually, and I'm kind of curious to hear also, Sandra, and with your work also with different practitioners that oftentimes assign to the law a very clear definition of what evidence is or are, and how through their practice and through the writing is being kind of, re-engaged the question, with what evidence are, maybe think with also the relation between the practitioners and the theory work, how the notion of evidence has been kind of re-questioned, repositioned all the time. And for you, Sarah, how working with legal terms and kind of improper them, through your theoretical work, how the notion of evidences keep being, keep insisting, keep being part of, you keep being in negotiation with, you can't just put it away when you work in kind of a complex political sense, but then keep problematize it all the time, not accepting it as a defined thing. Or what's your take? Or what's your question about how do you think about evidence? And
Okay, maybe to put this a little bit in context. So there is a book that I edited together with my colleague Guru Ertem, which title is Bodies of Evidence. And I think it was really meant as a project to hand over the question to different scholars and practitioners, in order to understand if and how bodies can become evidence. And what we were certainly not trying to get at was kind of to install any phantasm of bodies that give immediate access to reality, that kind of thing, or being that kind of authentic windows. And so this is not what we were getting at. But we were thinking, and coming from exactly different disciplines, different relations to political and social questions, that what type of evidence can bodies maybe, it was not so much are they or aren't they, I mean, they can be evidence as object. They have always been in law somehow. But we were thinking, with the knowledge and the sensitivity and methodologies from performing arts, for instance, how can we think about other kind of layers of evidence that bodies, or let's say bodily experiences, can maybe bring, ranging from the somatic to the affective to really choreographically speaking measurements in times and space. So very different, really thinking through choreographic or dramaturgical, I would maybe say, categories. And it's so interesting now when you say, how do you come to these type of questions? I was thinking, how not to come to these type of questions. Not in the sense of that, I think I've always thought about choreography as really something to as a kind of scheme, as a kind of practice to enter, to sketch out realities really that are always at the intersections of aesthetic questions, and I'm explicitly not saying arts, but aesthetic questions, a question of perception, question of, you talk about performativity of law, and I find it, being not a lawyer, I sat through many trials just to understand this performance of law, no? And both and these strategies of victimizing people, that's one thing, creating narrations around them, but even on props and how you will perform things, it's highly performative. So there is that type of performativity, but also the things that are not so easy to see, no? The things that are really deeply installed, that made me find expression. I give you an example, which is a bit embarrassing example, but when pandemic started, I remember walking in Berlin, which is not a very dangerous place, that I caught myself holding my breath. No, and I talk about the very first week when, you know, when really literally you pass by other people and you hold your breath. So what does it mean? It means that there is an evaluation of risk. No, is this body a risky body or is it a safe body? That is not happening here, no, on logical things. It happens based on cliches, on stereotypes, on things that you have deeply embodied. Of course, that's something not very nice to admit, but I thought it was a very interesting thing, not to kind of connect these micropolitics of the body, like that moment of holding your breath, to actually criteria and values that we have. You know, how did we train to understand, you know, am I a safe body to you or not? You know, these kind of things. And I guess that kind of connection is very interesting. And I would maybe say I am not a choreographer at all. I did work as a dramaturg for many years, and maybe this is the missing link, no? That dramaturgy is, to my mind, a kind of practice of analyzing within a process that always thinks concrete decisions together with moving factors and environments. And a practice of analysis that is intellectual, but it is also very corporal. And I think this is the thing that we try to apply both from within concrete moments, like the one I just described, and trying to see how do they open questions to bigger scenarios. And this is maybe where this idea of evidence came in. We did not come up with any concluding definitions. I don't know how to do that. But no, I don't have any proper definition. And I was saying to Sarah, maybe it's also a way of, you know, kind of opening these questions to also understand their limits, no? Because what I also learned in these very transdisciplinary, or what I am learning constantly, also to see the limits of your methodologies, no? And where basically, when we met beforehand, I was saying, like, talking to lawyers, when I say body and you say body, we'll probably not at all speak about the same thing, no? So but to work on these things, to work from these dilemmas, basically.
Can I just say two quick things in response? So one is, about drama and choreography and the courtroom. I mean, absolutely. And again, I'm speaking from the common law system, which I do think is different from the civil law. But before I went into graduate study, I worked for a judge in Australia, and the level of ceremony and costume required for the proceeding depends on the kind of proceeding. So in civil trials where it's, you know, businesses suing each other, it's just money at stake. She'd just wear her black robe and her little wig. But when we had a murder trial, she would put on a long red robe and a full wig.
Now you know everything about choreography.
Yeah, and it's because, I mean, you know, no, these rules are just taken for granted, but I always thought it's because of the gravity of what is at stake, which is, you know, a lot in terms of what's occurred, but also in terms of what is going to happen to the accused. You know, should they be found guilty, this body will be constrained. You know, imprisonment for a very long time will occur, but all of the sort of pomp and ceremony that goes with, you know, the costumes and the lines that we recite, you know, I think is for the maintenance of authority to a system that, you know, sort of ultimately is questions of sovereignty and where the legitimacy of that comes from. And sovereignty, of course, is the underlying authority for the use of state violence. So this is, you know, I think what that choreography or what that performance is required for in terms of the re-performance of law. And yeah, so evidence for me was, you know, the worst subject at law school that everyone failed, and it's partly because there's very strict rules of evidence, and in the last panel there was discussion about sort of first person or second person, you know, and so the rule against hearsay, I can't remember it, but it's very strict and complicated. So you can't give second-hand evidence. There's a rule against that. Because I think because you are at risk of misinterpreting what you heard. And the court will not accept that. They'll only, yes. But how, and I don't work in criminal law, but how I've been thinking about evidence is in terms of the way that the legal requirements have changed in terms of how you prove that you own land. And if you sort of come from the starting point that owning a piece of land is actually a very strange thing to do in the first place, proving how you do that, again, requires a lot of ceremony. And in the common law system, it's was title deeds with, you know, fancy writing and wax seals and that kind of thing. But actually, a legal anthropologist, Alan Pottage, who's at Sciences Po now, but was at the LSE, he, in one of his histories of the development of these systems of how we prove that you own a piece of land, I think he's writing about the French context where the piece of paper that certified who owned it would be witnessed. And I mean, we're used to witnessing documents, but it doesn't really mean anything. But witnessing a document, if you're a witness to a document, in the old days, you could be called upon to actually swear that you saw that signature happen. But of course, with ownership of a piece of land, the intention is to own it for a very long time. And so there was a risk that the witness would die. And so if a conflict came up and the witness was dead, where did that leave you? So then they would have children as witnesses. But because children don't really understand what's happening in a courtroom and might forget the incident, it became a common practice to slap the child so that they would remember that moment and that they would be able to, yes. And so that's so interesting to me because it was like, wow, that was so embodied, right? And it's where we have got to now, which is that it's all on an electronic register, and you have actually no physical token that has any legal meaning. It's been quite an extreme shift that I think has also affected how we think about land and what ownership means. But yeah.
Less violent.
No, yes, violent in a different way, yeah.
Thank you. I think we are nearing the end of our time. Do we have 10 minutes? Okay. So, 10 minutes. So maybe it's a good time to invite the question from the audience.
Can we have a bit of light?
As I mentioned, you can ask it. Maybe we can.
The light you can have. It would be super if we could have a little bit less light or something so we can see people. We literally don't see anyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. I just had a question for, Sarah. I was really interested in this notion you had of bodies that are out of place and persistently stay out of place and how they generate a different spatiality. It made me think of Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, and I've heard bodies being categorized along different axes in this panel, these binaries of Western versus non-Western, or migrant versus non-migrant. And my question to you is, what would you think of a proposal that, heteronormative versus LGBT bodies, that they have very different politics of how they can move in public space? I mean, you have a city where there's one neighborhood that's designated for LGBT people. I mean, I'd love to see a city where there's this one neighborhood that's called the heterosexual neighborhood, and there's one parade per year for I'd love to see, again, a one parade where heterosexuals are, and even in certain cases, LGBT people, they're reluctant to make physical public displays of affection, and so on and so forth. They could face retribution or attacks. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the binary of heteronormative versus queer in terms of the politics of the body. And just very quick clarification question. When you said, again, for Sarah, when you were saying about how this hyper-performative victimhood of the migrant in Australia and actually reinforces colonial tropes, did you mean that because it reinforces that they have no agency, and that just reinforces colonial, white savior complex? Yep. So that's just a quick clarification. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Thanks for your question. Just in terms of that, we save you. Like it's a sort of a white savior. Like there's you are a victim of your own culture, and we're going to provide you with sanctuary for that in terms of the coloniality of that aspect. In terms of sexuality, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cases that I studied most were actually sexuality-based refugee claims, particularly those made by women. And yes, I mean, yeah, the way that we read bodies, I guess, in relation to each other, and bodies as gendered and sexualized in different ways, absolutely has material impacts on where those bodies can safely go and what they can do. And of course, you know, like I'm a mixed race lesbian myself, and you know there are ways in which I can choose to present my body that I know I will pass, and then there's sometimes that I can't, and that will be, you know, in relation to others. So yeah, I don't know whether I'd think about it as a binary, because I guess, and when you were talking about, you know, straight neighbourhoods and queer neighbourhoods, which of course we know exist in cities all over the place, like there's often the neighbourhoods that are sort of queer neighbourhoods can be gentrifying neighbourhoods, and it's white queer bodies who move in, and racial minorities, working class racial minorities who are moved out. And of course there will be sexual minorities amongst them, but they're not recognised. They don't go to the same kind of establishments as the, you know, urban development, which targets a particular kind of LGBT population does. But yeah, no, I absolutely think that the gender and sexuality of the body is a potent property of the body, and like determines that relationship with space for sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We have another question. I think second and last, right? I don't know. Irit.
I don't exactly know how to ask this question, but you're probably well aware that the British government, the British Home Office, has developed a policy of shipping migrants to Rwanda, where they will be processed. And they attempted an injunction against this by migrant human rights groups failed yesterday, and so it's very likely that on Tuesday the shipping of migrants to Rwanda will begin. And the thing I don't know how to ask about is, it seems to me that this has brought in a really new model that kind of departs from the two models that you've been talking about, in the sense that it brings in a certain logic of globalization and outsourcing that we haven't kind of thought into the annals of migration and its difficulties and the conflicts around it, because the sort of the logic of expulsion is then sustained by another logic, which is about, you know, things like shifting populations, and the sort of because on the Rwandan side of it, there is a question about population, and so there are kind of now other economies at play that are not the old economy of acceptance or exclusion, expulsion. But, and it's another kind of capitalist triumph in a way, moving this into the market of resources and circulations. And so I'm sort of wondering how one would now think the body into that kind of a situation, which is very disembodied because its logics are economic logics and they're not even legal logics. There are other kinds of logics, the resource logics and economic logics.
I'll just quickly respond and then I'll give it to Sandra. I mean, to be honest, I haven't followed that closely what's been happening with Rwanda because I'm so devastated that it is occurring after I've been watching the same system, Australia, do it for the past 20 years. I guess two things I would say is, and again, I don't know exactly what the British financial infrastructure of it is, but it's not really economically logical, at least in the Australian context. It costs so much more to ship people to faraway places and keep them there administratively for extended periods of time than it would to release them into the community. It's a massively, massively financially wasteful policy, at least in the way that it is implemented in Australia. So I do think that there absolutely are capitalist logics at play, but it's not a straightforward one. It's actually a massive expense to the government. And the second is that, I mean, you've all got me thinking about performance and choreography now, but like in Australia, the reason for doing that to people is absolutely performative. It's explicitly deterrence. It is we are going to make a huge spectacle of just how horrifically we are going to treat you in order to stop the boats, to stop the migrant boats. Our government ministers have been very explicit about that. In that sense, it's very embodied because this is what we are going to perform on these bodies in order to deter others from making the same journey.
No, I mean, I actually must say, yesterday when coming here, I heard about it, and it has been there has been attempts in Germany as well many years ago to exactly do that, to make deals and to basically send migrants elsewhere. I do very much agree with Sarah. So there is something about really like what is going to happen with you. But also what is interesting in these questions is, and this is a bit on a really small level. We are really in the middle of the process. What we are trying to track and trace in this Bodies Unprotected kind of project is how do these categories and the hierarchies of embodiment, and also even looking at refugees, there's nothing like the refugee, it's all individuals with different categories intersecting and so on, and how do they change? So yes, there is gender, yes, there is race and so on, but there is also exactly very new aspects coming in, and so part of the project is to. But again, we are really in a moment of conceptualizing it in terms of publishing it. Part of the project is kind of trying to come close to what is the distinctive elements. And when you were talking about binaries, I was just thinking on a very basic level. I mean, international humanitarian law is based, one of the bedrocks is distinction, no? Civilians, non-civilians, this and that, so there is this logic of distinction, but what if, how to actually deal with the fragmentation of life, the intersectional kind of aspects of life, if the legal frame is still one based on distinction, and maybe that experience-based approach to it that we, I think, try to discuss is a tentative to come close to this. As a really first proposals as a kind of counter proposal to that.
Thank you. I want to thank you both so much, and thank you. That's good.